The storms of life have a way of catching us completely off guard. One moment we're sailing smoothly through calm waters, and the next we're fighting against waves that threaten to overwhelm everything we hold dear. But what if I told you that in your darkest hour, when the winds are howling and hope seems lost, that's precisely when Jesus shows up. And not only does he show up, but he invites you to do the impossible. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most incredible accounts in Scripture, where an ordinary fisherman named Peter literally walked on water. This isn't just an ancient story, it's a blueprint for stepping out in faith when everything around you is falling apart. Picture this scene with me. It's the dead of night on the Sea of Galilee. The disciples are in a boat, fighting against brutal winds that have been battering them for hours. Their muscles ache, their hands are raw from gripping the oars, and exhaustion weighs heavy on their shoulders. Sound familiar? Maybe you're not battling literal waves, but perhaps you're wrestling with financial storms, relationship turbulence, or health challenges that feel just as overwhelming. The disciples had no idea they were about to witness something that would change their understanding of faith forever. Before we jump into the heart of this story, let me share something personal. Last year, I met Sarah, a single mother of 3 who lost her job during the pandemic. She told me that reading about Peter walking on water completely transformed how she approached her impossible circumstances. By the end of our conversation today, you'll understand exactly why this ancient account has the power to revolutionize your perspective on life's greatest challenges. The story begins in Matthew chapter 14, verse 22. Jesus had just performed the miracle of feeding 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Can you imagine the excitement and energy in that crowd? But instead of basking in the glory of this incredible moment, Jesus immediately told his disciples to get in their boat and crossed to the other side of the lake while he dismissed the crowd. There's something profound happening here that we often miss. Jesus was intentionally separating himself from the disciples because he knew what was coming next would require them to depend on faith rather than his physical presence. After sending the crowd away, Jesus went up on a mountainside to pray. Now, this wasn't just a quick prayer before dinner. Mark's gospel tells us that Jesus was there alone, communing with his Father while his disciples struggled against the wind and waves. Sometimes God allows us to enter seasons of struggle, not because he's abandoned us, but because he's preparing us for a breakthrough that requires a deeper level of trust than we've ever experienced before. Meanwhile, out on the lake, the disciples were having the fight of their lives. Matthew 14, verse 24 tells us they were straining at the oars because the wind was against them. The Greek word used here for straining literally means to be tortured or tormented. These weren't gentle waves lapping against their boat. This was a life-threatening storm. Have you ever been in a season where it felt like everything was working against you? Where no matter how hard you tried, you couldn't seem to make any progress? That's exactly where the disciples found themselves. Here's what's fascinating about this moment. The disciples were following Jesus' direct instructions. He had told them to cross to the other side, yet they found themselves in the midst of a terrifying storm. This teaches us something crucial about faith. Sometimes obedience to God's will doesn't lead to smooth sailing. In fact, often it's the opposite. When you're walking in God's purposes for your life, the enemy will unleash everything he has to stop you from reaching your destination. But here's where the story takes an incredible turn. In the 4th watch of the night, between 3 and 6 in the morning, when the disciples had been fighting this storm for hours and were probably at their breaking point, Jesus came to them. But he didn't come in a boat or by somehow calming the storm from the shore. Matthew 14, verse 25 says he came walking on the lake. Let that sink in for a moment. The very thing that was threatening to destroy the disciples, the raging water beneath their boat, became the pathway for Jesus to reach them. This is such a powerful picture of how God works in our lives. The very circumstances that feel like they're going to overwhelm us often become the platform for God to display his power and glory. That financial crisis you're facing, that broken relationship that's tearing your heart apart, that health scare that's keeping you awake at night. What if God wants to use that exact situation to reveal himself to you in a way you've never experienced before? When the disciples first saw Jesus walking on the water, they were terrified. Verse 26 says they thought he was a ghost and cried out in fear. Isn't it interesting how sometimes when God shows up in our impossible situations, our first response is fear rather than relief? We've become so accustomed to struggling in our own strength that when supernatural intervention appears, we don't recognize it as God's provision. But Jesus immediately spoke to their fear. He said, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." The phrase "it is I" in the original Greek is ego eimi, which is the same phrase God used to identify himself to Moses at the burning bush. Jesus wasn't just saying, "Hey guys, it's me." He was declaring his divine identity in the midst of their storm. When life feels out of control, remember that the great I Am is present in your situation. Now here comes the part of the story that absolutely amazes me every time I read it. Peter, impulsive Peter, who was known for speaking before thinking, had an incredible response. In verse 28, he said, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." I love Peter's heart here. He didn't just want to be rescued from his circumstances, he wanted to participate in the miracle. He saw Jesus doing the impossible and thought, "I want in on that." Think about Peter's request for a moment. He could have asked Jesus to calm the storm. He could have asked Jesus to get in the boat with them. Instead, he asked for permission to leave the safety of the boat and walk on the same impossible surface that Jesus was walking on. This reveals something powerful about Peter's character. He understood that being near Jesus meant he could do things that were completely beyond his natural ability. Jesus' response was simple but profound. Come. One word. No lengthy explanation, no detailed instructions about how to walk on water, just an invitation to step out of the boat. Sometimes God's call on our lives is just that simple. He sees us struggling in our comfortable but limiting circumstances, and he simply says, "Come. Step out of what you know and trust me with what you don't know." And here's where the story gets really exciting. Verse 29 says Peter got down out of the boat and walked on the water toward Jesus. Stop and think about that for a second. Peter, a seasoned fisherman who knew better than anyone else in that boat how impossible it was to walk on water, put his foot over the side of the boat and stepped onto the surface of a stormy sea. And it held him. This moment teaches us something revolutionary about faith. Faith isn't the absence of doubt or fear. Faith is acting in spite of doubt and fear. Peter probably felt his heart pounding as he swung his leg over the side of that boat. He probably heard his mind screaming that this was insane. But he took the step anyway because Jesus had said, "Come." I think about David, a friend of mine who started his own business 3 years ago. He had a secure job, a steady paycheck, and a comfortable life. But God kept stirring his heart about a vision that seemed impossible. When David finally made the decision to leave his job and step out in faith, his wife thought he'd lost his mind. His parents questioned his judgment. His friends thought he was making a huge mistake. But David knew he'd heard from God, so he took the step. Today, his business is thriving and providing jobs for 12 other people. Like Peter, David discovered that when God says come, the impossible becomes possible. But let's not skip over what happened next in Peter's story, because this is where most of us find ourselves when we step out in faith. Verse 30 tells us that when Peter saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink. Notice the text doesn't say the wind got stronger. It says Peter saw the wind. In other words, Peter took his eyes off Jesus and focused on his circumstances instead. This is such a human moment, isn't it? 1 second, Peter is experiencing the supernatural, walking on water like it's solid ground. The next second, his natural mind kicks in and reminds him that what he's doing is scientifically impossible. The moment his focus shifted from Jesus to the storm around him, he began to sink. How many times have we done exactly the same thing? We step out in faith, we see God beginning to move in our situation, and then we get distracted by the magnitude of our problems. We start calculating the odds, listening to the doubters, or focusing on everything that could go wrong. And just like Peter, we begin to sink. But here's the beautiful part of this story. Verse 30 tells us that as Peter was sinking, he cried out, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus reached out and caught him. Immediately. Not after Peter had learned his lesson or proven his commitment. The instant Peter called out for help, Jesus was there. This reveals something incredible about Jesus' character. He didn't rescue Peter and then lecture him about his lack of faith. He didn't let him sink a little bit deeper just to teach him a lesson. The moment Peter called out, Jesus responded with immediate compassion and rescue. This tells us that even when our faith wavers, even when we take our eyes off Jesus and start to sink, he's always ready to reach out and pull us back up. Jesus did ask Peter a question, though. "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" But I don't think this was condemnation. I think it was an invitation to understand what had happened. Jesus wasn't angry with Peter. He was helping him process the experience. Sometimes our failures become our greatest teachers if we're willing to examine what caused us to stumble. Notice that Jesus called it little faith, not no faith. Peter had enough faith to get out of the boat and walk on water, even if only for a few steps. Sometimes we're so hard on ourselves when our faith wavers that we forget to celebrate the fact that we had the courage to step out of the boat in the first place. How many of the other disciples experienced walking on water that night? Just Peter. Because Peter was the only one willing to leave his comfort zone. When Jesus and Peter climbed into the boat, immediately the wind died down. Think about the symbolism here. As long as Jesus was outside the boat, the storm continued. But the moment he got into the boat with the disciples, everything became calm. This teaches us that having Jesus in our situation changes everything. It's not just about believing in Jesus from a distance. It's about inviting him into the very center of whatever storm we're facing. This entire experience had deepened their understanding of who Jesus really was. They'd seen him feed 5,000 people earlier that day, but walking on water and enabling Peter to do the same thing took their faith to a completely new level. This brings us to some practical applications of this incredible story. First, understand that storms are often preparation for miracles. The disciples wouldn't have witnessed Jesus walking on water if they hadn't been in a storm. Your current struggle might feel overwhelming, but it could be the exact setup God needs to reveal his power in your life in a way you've never experienced before. Second, Jesus often shows up in the fourth watch. In ancient times, the night was divided into 4 watches, and the fourth watch was the darkest time, right before dawn. If you're in a season where it feels like God's timing is off, where you've been praying and believing and nothing seems to be happening, remember that God's breakthrough often comes in the darkest hour, right before your breakthrough dawn. Third, stepping out of the boat requires leaving your comfort zone. The other 11 disciples stayed in the safety of the boat and missed out on the miracle. They got to witness it, but they didn't get to participate in it. Sometimes God's call on our lives requires us to leave behind what feels secure in order to experience what's supernatural. Fourth, keep your eyes on Jesus, not on your circumstances. The moment Peter focused on the wind instead of Jesus, he began to sink. This doesn't mean we ignore reality or pretend our problems don't exist. It means we view our circumstances through the lens of God's character and promises, rather than viewing God through the lens of our circumstances. Fifth,
Help me,
when you
I
start
am
to sink,
sinking.
call out immediately.
Take my...
Don't try to save yourself or prove you can handle it on your own. The faster you cry out to Jesus, the faster he can rescue you. Pride will make you sink faster than doubt ever will. Let me tell you about Maria, a woman in our church who applied these principles in a remarkable way. 2 years ago, she received a diagnosis of cancer that doctors said was terminal. Instead of accepting that verdict as final, Maria decided to step out of the boat of conventional wisdom and walk on the water of God's promises for healing. She faced months of treatment, times when her faith wavered, moments when she focused on the storm instead of Jesus. But every time she started to sink, she cried out to God for help. Today, Maria is cancer-free and uses her story to encourage others to step out in faith when facing impossible situations. The truth is, we all have boats in our lives. These are the safe, predictable areas where we've learned to survive, but not necessarily thrive. Maybe your boat is a job that pays the bills, but doesn't fulfill your purpose. Maybe it's a relationship that's comfortable, but not growing. Maybe it's a mindset that protects you from disappointment, but also prevents you from experiencing God's best for your life. God isn't necessarily calling you to abandon everything that feels secure, but He might be calling you to step out of something in order to step into something greater. The key is learning to recognize His voice and having the courage to respond when He says, "Come." I want to address something that might be troubling some of you. You might be thinking, but what if I step out and fail? What if I sink like Peter did? Here's the beautiful truth about Peter's experience. Even though he sank, he still accomplished something that no other human being in history had done up to that point. He walked on water. Even his failure was more spectacular than most people's successes. When we step out in faith and things don't go exactly as planned, we haven't failed. We've simply gathered information about how to do it better next time. Peter learned something about the importance of keeping his focus on Jesus that he could only learn by taking that step out of the boat. Some lessons can only be learned through experience, not observation. Here's another powerful truth from this story. Jesus was walking on the water before Peter ever stepped out of the boat. In other words, Peter wasn't pioneering a new miracle. He was joining Jesus in something Jesus was already doing. When God calls us to step out in faith, He's not asking us to create something from nothing. He's inviting us to participate in what He's already doing. This perspective completely changes how we approach faith. Instead of feeling like we have to generate enough belief to make something happen, we can rest in the confidence that God is already at work. Our job isn't to create the miracle. Our job is to recognize what God is doing and join Him in it. Scripture tells us in Hebrews 11 verse 1 that faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. Peter couldn't see any scientific reason why the water should hold his weight, but he had confidence in the one who had called him to come. That's the essence of biblical faith, trusting in God's character and promises, even when our circumstances suggest otherwise. Let me share one final story that illustrates this beautifully. Rebecca is a friend who felt called to adopt children from the foster care system. She and her husband had one biological child and a comfortable life. Adoption seemed risky, expensive, and emotionally challenging, but God kept stirring their hearts about children who needed families. When they finally stepped out of their comfortable boat and began the adoption process, it was harder than they expected. There were legal complications, financial strains, and emotional ups and downs that made them question their decision multiple times. But today, Rebecca has a beautiful family of 5 children, 3 of whom came through adoption. She often says that stepping out of their comfort zone was the scariest and best decision they ever made. As we wrap up this incredible story, I want to leave you with some questions to consider. What is your boat? What area of your life feels safe and predictable, but might be limiting God's best for you? Where might Jesus be walking on the water of your impossible circumstances, inviting you to step out and join Him? What would change in your life if you truly believed that the God who created the universe is inviting you to participate in His miraculous work? Remember, the same Jesus who called Peter to walk on water is calling your name today. He sees the storms you're facing, and He's not intimidated by them. In fact, He's using them as the platform to reveal His power and glory in your life. The question isn't whether God is able to do the impossible in your situation. The question is whether you're willing to step out of your boat and discover what it feels like to walk on water. If you've been encouraged by Peter's story today, I want to challenge you to take one specific step of faith this week. Maybe it's having that difficult conversation you've been avoiding. Maybe it's applying for that job that seems out of reach. Maybe it's starting that ministry or business idea that God has placed in your heart. Whatever it is, remember that Jesus is already walking on the water of your impossible circumstances. He's simply waiting for you to say, "Lord, if that's you, call me to come." And when you hear that gentle but powerful invitation to come, have the courage to put your foot over the side of your boat and discover that with God, all things truly are possible.